Living in the city was supposed to be liberating. The anonymity, the crowds, the buzzing streets, all of it gave me a sense of freedom I'd never felt in the small town I grew up in. But anonymity has a darker side. It makes you invisible, yes, but it also makes you vulnerable. I learned that the hard way. It started on a cold autumn evening. I was leaving my evening shift at the cafe, my bag slung over my shoulder and a scarf wrapped tightly around my shoe. The streets were alive with the usual chaos, cars honking, people chatting, the occasional street performer drawing a small crowd. The city never really sleeps, and I had always found comfort in that. But that night something felt off. At first it was just a flicker of awareness. The kind of thing you might dismiss as nothing more than a passing thought. I had crossed the street, weaving through a group of tourists snapping pictures of the skyline, when I felt it, a weighty gaze that lingered too long. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a man standing across the street. He was wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but there was something about him that set my nerves on edge. I told myself it was nothing. In a city this big, it wasn't unusual to see someone standing around, minding their own business. I shrugged it off and kept walking, quickening my pace just slightly. The problem was, every time I glanced back, he was there. Always at a distance, but close enough to unsettle me. At first, I thought he might just be heading in the same direction. After all, we were downtown, and the streets were packed with people. But as I turned down side streets and took shortcuts I knew well, he never veered off. He was following me. I was sure of it. My heart began to pound in my chest, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I didn't want to panic, not yet. Panic makes you sloppy, makes you stand out, and I couldn't afford to draw attention. I ducked into a small convenience store, pretending to browse the shelves while keeping an eye on the door. He didn't come in, but when I stepped out a few minutes later, there he was, standing on the opposite side of the street. I decided to test him. I turned abruptly and walked in the direction I had just come from. The crowded sidewalk seemed to swallow me up for a moment, but when I glanced back, he was there, weaving through the crowd with an ease that made my stomach churn. That's when I knew it wasn't just coincidence. He was following me. I considered going to the police, but what would I say? A man is walking behind me? In a city full of people? That's hardly a crime. Still, the thought of heading straight home didn't sit right with me. I didn't want him to know where I lived. Instead, I decided to lose him. The city was my playground. I knew its twists and turns like the back of my hand. I darted down a narrow alley that connected to a busier street, my steps quick and purposeful. The alley smelled of garbage and damp concrete, the sound of distant car horns echoing faintly. When I emerged on the other side, I blended into the crowd, keeping my head down and my pace steady. For a moment I thought I'd done it. I thought I'd shaken him off. But as I turned into another street, I saw him again, his dark silhouette unmistakable against the bright glow of the streetlights. By now, fear had wrapped itself around my chest like a vice. I couldn't run. Running would draw too much attention. So I walked, faster and faster, my legs burning as I pushed through the throngs of people. Finally, I spotted a late-night diner up ahead. Its neon sign flickered weakly, but it was bright and full of people. I slipped inside and slid into a booth near the window. The waitress approached me with a tired smile, but I shook my head, mumbling something about needing a moment. My eyes were glued to the street outside. He didn't follow me in. For a while, I didn't see him at all, and I began to think he might have given up. I ordered a coffee, nursing it as the minutes ticked by, but just as I was starting to relax, I saw him again. He was across the street, leaning casually against a lamppost, his face obscured by the brim of his cap. He wasn't just following me anymore. He was waiting. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay in the diner forever, but stepping back onto the street felt like walking into a trap. I considered calling a friend, but it was late, and I didn't want to alarm anyone unnecessarily. Besides, what could they do? In the end, I decided to wait him out. Hours passed, the diner's once busy hum dwindling to near silence. I watched as the staff cleaned tables and refilled the ketchup bottles, my nerves fraying with every passing minute. But when I finally worked up the courage to glance outside again, he was gone. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. As I stepped out into the cold night air, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, lurking just out of sight. The city's familiar noise felt muted, the shadows deeper, the streets less welcoming. I made it home that night, but I didn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind, sent my heart racing. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the memory of his dark silhouette. I take different routes to work, avoid walking alone, and keep my phone in my hand at all times. But no matter what I do, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting. It was a Thursday evening, and the city was alive with its usual buzz. I had just left my painting class, my bag weighed down with brushes and half-dried canvases. The air was crisp, with a faint scent of rain that hadn't yet arrived. Normally I'd take the bus home, but tonight I felt like walking. The route was well lit, and the streets were busy. It felt safe. About halfway through my walk, I noticed him. A man in a gray hoodie, standing under a flickering street lamp. He wasn't doing anything particularly alarming, just leaning against the post with his hands in his pockets. Still, something about him made my skin crawl. I turned my gaze back to the sidewalk and kept moving. It wasn't until I passed a shop window and caught his reflection that I realized he was walking behind me. At first, I thought it was just coincidence. The city was full of people heading in the same direction, but as I made turn after turn, he stayed there, always at the same measured distance. By the time I reached the third block, my unease had blossomed into full-fledged fear. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe he was just another pedestrian on his way home. Maybe I was imagining things. Or maybe, just maybe, he was following me. I decided to test him. I ducked into a convenience store, pretending to browse the shelves while keeping an eye on the glass door. Moments later, he walked by, his pace slow and deliberate. My heart pounded as I waited, hoping he'd keep going. But after a minute, I saw him through the glass, standing just outside, as if waiting for me to come out. Panic set in. My first thought was to call the police, but what would I tell them? A man is standing outside a store? It wasn't exactly a crime. Instead, I pulled out my phone and called my roommate Megan. She didn't pick up, so I left a hurried voicemail, whispering that I might need help. When I finally stepped out of the store, I made a sharp turn and headed toward the main avenue. My plan was to lose him in the crowd, but no matter how fast I walked or how many people surrounded me, I couldn't shake the feeling of his presence. I didn't dare look back. Then I spotted the entrance to a subway station. Without thinking, I darted down the stairs, hoping the labyrinth of tunnels and trains would throw him off. The station was crowded, a rush of commuters pushing past me. I scanned the crowd, searching for his gray hoodie, but I didn't see him. Relief washed over me as I boarded the next train. The doors slid shut, and the train jolted forward, pulling me away from the station. For the first time in what felt like hours, I allowed myself to breathe, but the relief was short-lived. As the train pulled into the next station, I looked through the window and saw him standing on the platform. He must have taken another entrance, tracking my route. My stomach dropped as he stepped onto the train, his eyes scanning the crowd. I ducked behind a tall man holding a newspaper, praying he wouldn't see me. The train rattled forward, each stop feeling like an eternity. Finally, I decided to get off at a busy station and disappear into the crowd. When the train came to a halt, I bolted. I wove through the throng of commuters, my bag bumping against my side. My breath came in gasps as I ascended the stairs, emerging onto a bustling street. I didn't stop moving until I reached a crowded bar. The neon sign above the door cast a warm glow, and the sound of laughter and clinking glasses spilled out into the night. I slipped inside and took a seat near the back, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my phone. This time, Megan answered. I tried to keep my voice steady as I told her what had happened. She insisted on coming to get me, and I agreed, giving her the address of the bar. While I waited, I kept glancing at the door, half expecting him to walk in, but he never did. By the time Megan arrived, I felt like I'd aged 10 years. We took a cab home, and she stayed up with me, making tea and cracking jokes to lighten the mood. But even her comforting presence couldn't erase the image of his gray hoodie and the way he'd seemed to melt into the crowd, always just out of reach. The next morning, I reported the incident to the local precinct. The officer I spoke to was polite but nonchalant, assuring me they'd keep an eye out. I knew they wouldn't find him. Days passed and the fear began to fade, replaced by a cautious vigilance. I stopped walking home alone, avoided dark streets, and kept my phone charged at all times. Life went on, but the memory of that night lingered. Even now, when I'm walking through the city, I can't help but glance over my shoulder. I tell myself it's just a precaution, that lightning doesn't strike twice, but deep down I know the truth. In a city this big, it's easy to disappear, and sometimes that includes the people who stalk the shadows. It started on a rainy Friday evening. The streets were slick with water, reflecting the dazzling neon lights of the city. I was heading home after a long shift at the diner, my apron stuffed into my bag and my shoes squeaking with each step. The subway was packed as usual, and I barely managed to squeeze myself into a corner near the door. The first time I noticed him was when the train stopped at 47th Street. He stood at the edge of the platform, his dark coat hanging loose on his thin frame. Something about the way he watched the train unsettled me, but I brushed it off. People in the city always stared, it wasn't anything new. When the doors opened, he stepped onto the train and positioned himself directly across from me. His eyes never left mine, even as the train lurched forward. I averted my gaze, staring at the advertisements plastered above the windows, but I could feel his attention like a physical weight. At my stop, I hurried off the train, weaving through the crowd as fast as I could. I didn't look back until I reached the escalators, and even then, I told myself I was being paranoid, but as I glanced over my shoulder, I saw him. He was walking in a steady pace, his dark coat billowing slightly as he navigated the throng of commuters. By the time I reached the street, my nerves were on edge. The rain had picked up, and the sound of it hitting the pavement drowned out the usual city noise. I tightened my grip on my bag and turned down a side street, hoping to lose him in the maze of alleyways. For a few minutes, I thought it had worked. The street was quiet, and I couldn't hear any footsteps behind me. But then, as I passed a row of parked cars, I caught a glimpse of him in the window's reflection. He was still there, his pace unchanging, his gaze locked on me. Panic set in. I quickened my steps, my breath coming in short gasps. The city felt impossibly large and empty all at once. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me, every sound amplified in the silence. I turned another corner and spotted a 24-hour convenience store. Without hesitation, I darted inside, the fluorescent lights glaringly bright after the dimness of the street. The clerk barely looked up from his magazine as I pretended to browse the shelves, my eyes darting to the glass doors. Minutes passed and I didn't see him. Slowly, my heartbeat began to steady. I convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing, that he wasn't really following me. But when I finally stepped outside, he was waiting. He stood across the street, half hidden under an awning, his eyes glinting in the streetlight. I ran. I didn't think about where I was going, only that I needed to put as much distance between us as possible. My shoes slipped on the wet pavement, and my bag thumped against my side, but I didn't dare slow down. Eventually, I found myself in a small park. The trees provided some cover from the rain, and the path was deserted. I ducked behind a bench, crouching low as I tried to catch my breath. For a while, there was only the sound of rain and the distant hum of traffic. I started to believe I had lost him. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a movement. He was there, standing at the edge of the park. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched. My phone was in my pocket, but my hands were shaking too much to use it. Instead, I stayed crouched, hoping the darkness would hide me. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Finally, he turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the shadows. I waited until I was sure he was gone before making my way out of the park. I flagged down the first cab I saw and gave the driver my address, my voice trembling as I spoke. When I got home, I locked every door and window, double-checking each one before collapsing onto the couch. My phone buzzed with a text from my coworker asking if I had made it home safely. I didn't reply. The next morning, I went to the police station. The officer I spoke to was polite but dismissive. Without a clear threat or evidence, there wasn't much they could do. In the weeks that followed, I avoided walking alone at night. I stopped taking the subway altogether, opting for buses and ride shares instead. Life went on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. Sometimes when I'm in a crowded place, I'll catch a glimpse of a dark coat or a familiar face. It's never him, but my heart races all the same. The city is a vast, unforgiving place. And in its shadows, there are people like him, waiting for someone to make a wrong move. I was lucky to escape that night, but I know not everyone does. It was the middle of summer when I first noticed him. The city pulsed with its usual energy tourists snapping photos, buskers playing music on the sidewalks, and vendors peddling everything from roasted peanuts to counterfeit watches. I had just left a friend's apartment after a dinner party and decided to walk the 3 blocks home instead of calling a cab. It was one of those rare, warm evenings when the streets seemed alive with possibility, and I wanted to soak it all in. The busier streets were crowded, the kind of chaos that felt oddly comforting. But as I turned onto the quieter stretch leading to my building, the atmosphere shifted. The chatter and laughter from the main avenues faded into the hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. That's when I saw him. He was leaning against a lamppost up ahead, the dim streetlight casting a faint glow over his figure. He wasn't doing anything overtly suspicious, just standing there, looking across the street at nothing in particular. Still, something about him felt off. His posture was too stiff, his gaze too focused. As I passed him, I couldn't help but notice how his eyes seemed to flicker toward me. There was an intensity in his look that made my stomach tighten. I kept walking, pretending not to notice, but the weight of his gaze lingered. When I glanced over my shoulder a few moments later, he was gone. The empty sidewalk should have reassured me, but instead it made me feel more vulnerable. A block later, I heard footsteps. At first, I thought it was just another pedestrian heading home. But the rhythm of the steps matched mine too closely, stopping when I paused to check my phone and resuming as I continued. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was nothing, just a coincidence, but my pulse quickened anyway. To shake the unease, I crossed the street and ducked into a small convenience store. The clerk barely looked up as I entered, his attention focused on his phone. I pretended to browse the snack aisle while keeping an eye on the front window. It didn't take long to spot him. He was standing on the opposite sidewalk, not even bothering to hide his presence. He wasn't staring directly at the store, but was close enough to make it clear he was waiting for me. I lingered for what felt like an eternity, debating whether to ask the clerk for help. But what could I say? That a man was standing outside? It wasn't illegal to stand on a public street, and I had no concrete evidence he was following me. When a small group of people passed by the store, I seized the opportunity. I slipped out behind them, blending into their group as they made their way toward the main avenue. For a while it worked. The man didn't follow, and I felt a small sense of victory. But the relief was short-lived. When I reached my apartment building, I spotted him again. He was across the street, leaning against a parked car, pretending to read a magazine. My heart sank. He hadn't lost track of me after all. I couldn't go inside and risk him knowing where I lived, so I kept walking, circling the block while trying to come up with a plan. Eventually, I ducked into a coffee shop that stayed open late. The barista gave me a curious look as I ordered a tea and took a seat near the back. From my vantage point, I could see the street outside. Sure enough, he was there, pacing up and down the sidewalk. Every so often, he would glance toward the shop, though he never came closer. I tried to calm myself, reasoning that if he had wanted to hurt me, he would have done so by now. But the logic didn't ease the gnawing fear in my chest. I stayed in the shop until closing time, hoping he would get bored and leave. When I finally stepped outside, the street was empty. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by paranoia. I hurried home, constantly glancing over my shoulder. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside my window sent my heart racing. By morning, I was exhausted but determined not to let the fear consume me. For the next few days, I adjusted my routine. I took different routes to work, avoided walking alone, and stayed in crowded areas whenever possible. But no matter how careful I was, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't long before the sightings began again. I'd catch glimpses of him in the reflection of a storefront window or standing on the corner as I waited for the light to change. He never approached me, never said a word, but his presence was suffocating. One evening, as I stepped out of a grocery store with a bag of essentials, I spotted him across the street. This time he wasn't pretending to be inconspicuous. He was staring directly at me, his expression unreadable. I panicked. Without thinking, I turned and started walking briskly in the opposite direction. My apartment was only a few blocks away, but I couldn't risk leading him there. Instead, I ducked into an alley, hoping to lose him in the maze of side streets. The alley was eerily quiet, the distant noise of the city muffled by the towering buildings. I could hear my own breathing shallow and rapid as I pressed myself against the wall. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. My mind raced, searching for an escape route. The alley was a dead end, the only exit the way I had come in. Just as the footsteps reached the entrance, I spotted a fire escape ladder a few feet away. Without hesitation, I grabbed onto it and climbed, my hands trembling as I hoisted myself onto the first platform. From my perch, I watched as the man entered the alley. He paused, looking around as if trying to figure out where I had gone. For a moment I thought he might leave. But then he looked up. Our eyes met, and my blood turned to ice. He didn't say anything, didn't shout or make any threats. He just stood there, staring at me with that same unnerving intensity. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I climbed higher, moving as quickly as I could until I reached the roof. From there I scrambled across the buildings, adrenaline fueling my every step. When I finally reached a safe distance, I climbed down and flagged a cab. The driver gave me a concerned look as I slid into the back seat, breathless and shaking. That night I stayed at a friend's place, too afraid to go back to my own apartment. I filed a police report the next day, but without a clear description or evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Weeks passed, and I started to believe he was gone. But every now and then I catch a glimpse of him in a crowd or feel the weight of his gaze on the back of my neck. The city is vast, a labyrinth of streets and faces. But in its shadows he's still there, waiting. For now I'm safe. But I know it's only a matter of time before our paths cross again. There was some